8-year-old Ruby Collins invited her street garbage man to her birthday party, which didn't please her appearance-obsessed mother. But when the once-judgmental neighborhood learned about what he did in the past, everyone's minds changed. Ruby raced through the backyard, her golden curls flying as she celebrated her 8th birthday. To her, there were no strangers, only people who hadn't yet become friends. And so, when George Simmons, the garbage man, appeared at the gate that morning, his weathered face breaking into a hesitant smile, Ruby ran to him without hesitation. George had always been a quiet presence in the neighborhood, collecting trash with steady hands and a dignified demeanor. To most adults, he blended into the background, invisible despite his weekly visits. But to Ruby, he was someone special, a man who worked hard and greeted everyone politely, even when they ignored him or treated him with thinly veiled disdain. She admired the way he carried himself, as though he bore the weight of the world but refused to let it break him. Earlier that week, Ruby had decided to invite George to her party. For her, it wasn't an act of rebellion or defiance. It was simply an extension of her boundless kindness. Armed with colored paper and glitter glue, she crafted a small card adorned with flowers and stars. "Dear Mr. George," it read in wobbly handwriting, "you are invited to my birthday party on Saturday. Please come." On Thursday morning, she slipped the invitation into his gloved hand, her blue eyes shining with hope. George hesitated, touched by the gesture but acutely aware of the unspoken boundaries between them. Still, he couldn't disappoint the child's earnestness. "Thank you, Ruby," he said softly, tucking the card into his pocket. "I'll think about it." The day of the party arrived, and Mary Ellen, Ruby's mother, buzzed around the backyard like a queen bee overseeing her hive. Every detail, the table settings, the floral arrangements, the catered food, was meticulously planned to impress their neighbors. Dressed in a sundress and heels, Mary Ellen exuded an air of polished perfection. Her blonde hair shimmered under the sunlight, and her smile was radiant, though tinged with anxiety. Today wasn't just about celebrating Ruby. It was also about proving to Harry, her estranged husband, that she could provide the ideal life for their daughter, and maybe even win him back. Harry arrived shortly before the guests, his casual attire standing in stark contrast to Mary Ellen's carefully curated image. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, with sharp features and a weary expression. Years of living with Mary Ellen's superficiality had worn him down, and he'd left not out of anger but exhaustion. Yet here he was, fulfilling his parental duty, attending Ruby's birthday party, despite the tension that still lingered between them. As neighbors trickled in, the atmosphere grew lively. Children chased each other around the yard while adults mingled over cocktails and appetizers. Ruby flitted among the guests, introducing herself and ensuring everyone felt welcome. Then, just as Mary Ellen was congratulating herself on a flawless event, a murmur rippled through them. Standing near the gate was George, dressed in his usual uniform but holding a modest bouquet of wildflowers. His presence was unexpected, jarring even, and the whispers began almost immediately. Some guests exchanged skeptical glances, while others outright frowned. A few children snickered, mimicking their parents' disapproval. "What are you doing here?" Mary Ellen hissed, keeping her voice low but laced with venom. "You don't belong at this party." George met her gaze calmly, unfazed by her hostility. "Your daughter invited me," he replied evenly. "She wanted me here." Before Mary Ellen could respond, Ruby appeared, beaming with excitement. "Mr. George!" she exclaimed, grabbing his hand. "I'm so glad you came." Mary Ellen's heart twisted painfully. She glanced around, seeing the curious stares of her neighbors, and felt the walls of her carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. Panic surged within her, and she reached for Ruby, pulling her away from George. "Ruby, sweetheart, why don't you go play with your friends? Mr. George needs to leave now." "No!" Ruby cried, tears welling up in her eyes. "He's my friend. You can't make him go." The scene drew more attention, and the murmurs grew louder. Harry, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward. "Mary Ellen," he said firmly, This is ridiculous. Let the man stay. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Mary Ellen hesitated. She knew Harry was right, but pride and fear of judgment kept her rooted in place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she relented. Fine, she snapped, glaring at George. But stay out of sight. George nodded, his expression unreadable. He retreated to a corner of the yard, where he stood quietly, observing the festivities. Ruby, still clutching his hand, refused to let him out of her sight. As the party continued, the tension simmered beneath the surface. Some children followed Ruby's example, approaching George with curiosity rather than contempt. Others mirrored their parents' attitudes, whispering cruel jokes behind cupped hands. The divide among the children reflected the fractures already present in the adults' world. Harry watched the chaos unfold with growing discomfort. He had left Mary Ellen partly because of her obsession with appearances and societal approval, yet here she was, doubling down on those very traits. When Ruby stepped between her mother and George, tears streaming down her face, Harry felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for his daughter, but for the quiet dignity George had maintained throughout the ordeal. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the party wound down, Mary Ellen retreated to the house, shaken by the events of the day, and Ruby approached George with gratitude, unaware of the full extent of his sacrifice. Little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary birthday party would set off a chain reaction, challenging prejudices and inspiring acts of kindness where none existed before. And though the journey was far from over, the seeds of change had been planted. The aftermath of the party lingered like an unspoken tension, heavy and suffocating. In the backyard, remnants of the celebration lay scattered. Crumpled napkins, half-empty cups, and deflated balloons sagging against the fence. Harry wandered among the debris, collecting plates and straightening chairs. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were processing something far deeper than the physical mess before him. He paused near the corner where George had stood earlier, his brow furrowing as he stared at the empty space. There was something familiar about the man, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. "Why are you still out here?" Mary Ellen's voice cut through the quiet night air, sharp and defensive. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her posture rigid. Harry turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Just cleaning up," he said evenly, though his tone carried an undercurrent of frustration. "You know, you could have handled that better." Mary Ellen bristled. "Handled what better? That man showing up uninvited and embarrassing us in front of everyone? Or maybe you mean letting him stick around while our daughter cried like it was the end of the world." "It wasn't about him embarrassing us," Harry shot back, his voice rising slightly. "It was about how you treated him. Did it ever occur to you that maybe Ruby saw something in him worth respecting? Something none of us gave him credit for?" Mary Ellen opened her mouth to retort but stopped herself. The accusation stung more than she cared to admit. Instead, she turned away, muttering, "It's not about Ruby. It's about what the neighbors will say. You wouldn't understand." Harry exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's exactly why I left, Mary Ellen. Your obsession with appearances, it blinds you to what really matters." His words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Harry bent down to pick up a forgotten napkin, his gaze drifting again to the spot where George had stood. The familiarity nagged at him, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness until he couldn't ignore it any longer. Later that night, unable to sleep, Harry found himself digging through old boxes in the attic. Among faded photographs and yellowed documents, he unearthed a file labeled Ruby's hospital records. Flipping through the pages, he came across a name he hadn't thought about in years: George Simmons. Beneath it was a note confirming his role as the anonymous blood donor who had saved Ruby's life when she was just 4 years old. A wave of emotion crashed over Harry. Gratitude, guilt, awe all tangled together. He remembered the day vividly. Sitting in the sterile hospital waiting room, watching doctors and nurses rush past, praying for a miracle. And then there was George, calm and self-assured, offering his arm without hesitation. At the time, Harry hadn't paid much attention to the man beyond a brief nod of thanks. But now, staring at the name on the page, everything clicked into place. The next morning, Harry confronted Mary Ellen in the kitchen. She was sipping coffee, her usual mask of composure firmly in place, but her hands trembled slightly as she set the mug down. "We need to talk," Harry said, sliding the document across the table toward her. Mary Ellen glanced at it, confusion flickering across her face. "What is this?" "That's George," Harry replied, his voice tight with restrained anger. "He donated blood to save Ruby's life when she was sick. He didn't have to do it, he didn't even ask for recognition, but he did it anyway. And yesterday, you treated him like garbage." Mary Ellen's breath hitched as she read the details. Her stomach churned with a mix of disbelief and shame. How could she not have known? How could she have humiliated someone who had once been her daughter's literal lifeline? "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I'd known." "But you didn't bother to find out," Harry interrupted, his tone cutting. "You judged him based on his job, his skin color, his place in your precious social hierarchy. And for what? To protect your image." Mary Ellen flinched as though struck. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let Harry see her unravel. "I'm sorry," she murmured, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Harry leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Mary Ellen. Not yet, anyway. If you really mean it, prove it. Do something that shows you've changed." For days afterward, Mary Ellen wrestled with Harry's words. They haunted her, echoing in her mind whenever she passed George on the street or caught sight of Ruby playing in the yard. She wanted to believe she could change, that she could shed the superficial values that had defined her for so long. But old habits clung to her like shadows, refusing to dissipate. Still, she made an effort. One afternoon, she approached George as he collected trash outside her house. Her voice wavered as she spoke, each word feeling foreign on her tongue. "George, I owe you an apology. For everything. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did at the party, or ever really." George paused, his gloved hands resting on the handle of his cart. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply, his tone devoid of bitterness or triumph. Though relieved, Mary Ellen knew her actions weren't enough to erase years of prejudice. She continued trying, making small changes in how she interacted with others. Yet beneath the surface, her insecurities simmered, threatening to undermine her progress. Harry noticed these fragile attempts at transformation during his visits. While he appreciated the effort, he remained skeptical. Mary Ellen's gestures often felt performative, lacking the authenticity needed to convince him, or herself, that real change was taking root. Still, he couldn't deny the subtle shifts. She began spending more time with Ruby, listening instead of dictating, and occasionally acknowledged the humanity of those she might have dismissed in the past. These moments, though fleeting, offered glimmers of hope. Meanwhile, Ruby thrived in the wake of these changes. Every Thursday morning, she waited eagerly by the window for George's arrival. When he appeared, she ran out to greet him with a juice box or a handmade card, her smile radiant. George always accepted her gifts graciously, chuckling softly as he ruffled her hair. To Ruby, he wasn't just the garbage man. He was a friend, a hero, someone who mattered deeply to her. As weeks turned into months, whispers of George's kindness spread throughout the neighborhood. Some residents began greeting him warmly, their attitudes softening in the face of Ruby's unwavering admiration. Others remained indifferent, clinging to their biases, but the tide was slowly shifting. And yet, for all the external progress, Mary Ellen's internal struggle persisted. She yearned for Harry's approval, desperate to prove that she was worthy of another chance. But deep down, she knew forgiveness, both from him and herself, would require more than apologies and half-hearted gestures. It would demand honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the parts of herself she feared most. Mary Ellen sat on the edge of Ruby's bed, watching her daughter sleep. The soft glow of a nightlight cast flickering shadows across the room, illuminating Ruby's peaceful face. She looked so small, so innocent, and yet she had unknowingly set off a chain reaction that was reshaping their lives. Mary Ellen sighed, running a hand through her hair as guilt gnawed at her insides. How could someone so young possess such clarity, while she had spent years blinded by vanity and fear? It wasn't just Harry's words that haunted her now. It was Ruby's unwavering trust in George. Every Thursday morning, without fail, Ruby would wait by the window for his arrival, her eyes lighting up when he appeared. And every time Mary Ellen watched them interact, a quiet conversation about school or the weather, she felt a pang of inadequacy. Her daughter saw the world differently, unburdened by the prejudices and insecurities that weighed Mary Ellen down. Determined to prove herself, Mary Ellen began taking small steps toward change. At first, they were almost imperceptible. A polite nod to George when he passed by, an effort to engage neighbors in genuine conversation rather than superficial pleasantries. But slowly, these gestures grew bolder. One afternoon, she invited 2 of Ruby's classmates over for a playdate, including Mia, whose family had recently moved into the neighborhood. Mia's parents were immigrants, and Mary Ellen had initially dismissed them as outsiders. Now, she found herself laughing alongside them, marveling at how easily they connected once she let her guard down. Still, old habits clung to her like cobwebs. When Harry visited, bringing Ruby ice cream from her favorite shop, Mary Ellen couldn't help but fuss over appearances. She tidied the living room obsessively, ensuring every cushion was perfectly aligned and every surface spotless. It was as if she believed cleanliness could mask the cracks in her character, smoothing over the flaws Harry had pointed out. "You don't have to do all this," Harry said one evening, gesturing to the immaculate space around them. "We're not here for your housekeeping skills." Mary Ellen stiffened, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I know," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "I just want things to look nice." Harry studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You've been trying, haven't you?" She hesitated, caught off guard by his observation. "Trying what?" "To be better," he said simply. "To see people differently. I've noticed, Mary Ellen. You're not the same person you were a few months ago." His words filled her with a strange mixture of hope and dread. Hope because maybe he was starting to believe in her again. Dread because she knew how fragile her progress still was. Beneath the surface, the old Mary Ellen lurked, whispering doubts and fears. What if she failed? What if she slipped back into her old ways? Despite her internal struggles, Mary Ellen continued pushing forward. She started volunteering at Ruby's school, something she'd never considered before. At first, it was awkward. She fumbled through conversations with other parents, unsure of how to act without her usual armor of confidence. But gradually, she found her footing, helping organize events, assisting teachers, and getting to know the children gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she'd been missing. At the park, Ruby ran ahead to greet George. This time, instead of hanging back, Mary Ellen approached him too. "Good morning, George," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Ruby tells me you've been teaching her about recycling. Thank you for that." George smiled faintly, leaning against his cart. "She's a smart girl, eager to learn." "Yes, she is," Mary Ellen agreed, glancing at Ruby, who was showing George a drawing she'd made of their street. "And I wanted to thank you again, for everything. Not just the party, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the depth of her gratitude. George nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're welcome. Just doing my part." Though brief, the exchange left Mary Ellen feeling lighter, as though she'd shed another layer of the weight she'd carried for so long. Over the following weeks, she made it a point to speak with George whenever their paths crossed. Their conversations remained simple, weather updates, comments about the neighborhood, but each interaction chipped away at the barriers she'd built between them. Ruby, meanwhile, thrived under George's quiet mentorship. He taught her about the importance of hard work, kindness, and seeing value in everyone, regardless of their station in life. To Ruby, these lessons were second nature, but for Mary Ellen, they were revelations. She began noticing things she'd overlooked before. The way Mrs. Patel, their elderly neighbor, struggled to carry groceries inside. The loneliness in Mr. Thompson's eyes as he watered his garden alone each evening. Slowly, she started reaching out, offering help where she could, forming connections that went beyond surface-level niceties. Yet, for all her efforts, Mary Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that Harry remained unconvinced. Though he visited regularly, spending more time with Ruby and occasionally staying for dinner, his interactions with Mary Ellen were guarded. He praised her changes cautiously, as if afraid to encourage false hope. "You're doing well," he told her one evening after tucking Ruby into bed. "But Mary Ellen, forgiveness isn't something you earn overnight. It's about consistency, about proving that these changes aren't temporary." "I understand," she replied softly, meeting his gaze, "and I'm willing to prove it, if you'll give me the chance." Harry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her face, searching for signs of sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll give you that chance. But remember, it's about who you want to be, who you can be." Mary Ellen embraced the challenge. She joined a local book club, seeking intellectual stimulation and meaningful friendships. She attended community meetings, voicing her opinions on issues she cared about. And most importantly, she listened to Ruby, to Harry, and to the world around her. Through it all, George remained a constant presence in their lives. While he continued his work with quiet dignity, he also became a symbol of resilience and redemption within the neighborhood. People who had once ignored him now greeted him warmly, acknowledging the role he played in fostering unity and understanding. The first signs of spring arrived quietly, painting the neighborhood in soft hues of green and gold. The air carried a crispness that hinted at renewal, and for Mary Ellen, it felt like a metaphor she couldn't ignore. Change was happening. Yet, she knew better than to call it completion. This was merely the beginning of something fragile, something still taking root. Ruby had taken to leaving small gifts for George on their front porch every Thursday morning. Each time George arrived to collect the trash, he'd pause by the porch, chuckling softly as he picked up the offering. Sometimes, Ruby would run out to greet him, her golden curls bouncing as she chattered excitedly about school or her latest drawing. Other times, she'd wave shyly from the window if she was busy with homework. Either way, George always responded with warmth, his quiet demeanor masking the depth of his gratitude. It made Mary Ellen wonder, when had she lost that ability to see others clearly? And could she ever fully reclaim it? One sunny afternoon, as Mary Ellen watered the flowers in her garden, Mrs. Patel approached her with a basket of freshly baked cookies. "For you and Ruby," she said warmly, her voice accented but kind. Mary Ellen smiled, accepting the gift with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Mrs. Patel. This is so thoughtful." "It's nothing," Mrs. Patel replied, brushing off the compliment. "You've been helping me carry groceries lately. I wanted to return the favor." Their conversation lingered longer than usual, touching on topics ranging from gardening tips to shared frustrations about rising property taxes. As they parted ways, Mary Ellen realized how much she enjoyed these moments, moments that transcended the superficial pleasantries she once relied on. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not because of appearances but because of connection. Harry noticed these changes during his visits. He no longer found himself cringing at Mary Ellen's attempts to impress him. Instead, he saw glimpses of authenticity breaking through her polished exterior. One evening, after tucking Ruby into bed, he lingered in the living room, watching as Mary Ellen flipped through a photo album. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a picture of Ruby as a toddler, covered in birthday cake frosting. Harry laughed, leaning closer to get a better look. "How could I forget? She looked like she'd bathed in chocolate." They spent the next hour reminiscing, sharing stories and laughter in a way they hadn't done in years. For a brief moment, the tension between them dissolved, replaced by something softer, more familiar. When Harry finally stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to face her. "You're different," he said quietly. "Not completely, but enough to make me hopeful. Mary Ellen swallowed hard, her throat tightening with emotion. I'm trying, Harry. Really, I am. I believe you, he replied, his tone sincere. And that means something. Though his words offered validation, Mary Ellen knew she still had work to do. There were days when old habits resurfaced, tempting her to retreat into the safety of her former self. But each time she resisted, choosing instead to embrace vulnerability, she felt a little stronger. George continued his work with quiet dignity. His presence now met with respect rather than disdain. Neighbors who had once dismissed him began engaging him in conversation, asking about his day or thanking him for keeping their streets clean. Children followed Ruby's example, greeting him with smiles and waves. Even those who remained skeptical softened over time, influenced by the ripple effect of kindness Ruby had sparked. One Saturday morning, Mary Ellen accompanied Ruby to the park, where George often took a break during his route. As they approached, Ruby ran ahead, calling out to him with delight. This time, instead of hanging back, Mary Ellen joined them, sitting on a nearby bench as Ruby proudly showed George a new drawing she'd made. She's quite the artist, George remarked, glancing at Mary Ellen with a faint smile. Yes, she is, Mary Ellen agreed, returning his smile. She gets it from her father. Harry, who happened to be visiting that day, chuckled from behind her. Don't give me all the credit. You've got creativity in you too. You just don't use it enough. Mary Ellen raised an eyebrow, feigning offense. Excuse me? Who redecorated the entire house last year? That's design, not creativity, Harry teased, earning a playful swat on the arm. For a fleeting moment, it felt like old times. Their banter light, their laughter genuine. Though the road to reconciliation was far from smooth, moments like these reminded Mary Ellen why it was worth pursuing. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood underwent subtle but significant shifts. People who had once kept to themselves began reaching out, forming bonds that transcended class, race, and status. At the center of it all was Ruby, her simple act of inviting George to her party having ignited a chain reaction that challenged long-held prejudices and inspired acts of kindness where none existed before. For Mary Ellen, the journey was ongoing. She still grappled with her insecurities and desire for validation, but she was learning to channel those feelings into something constructive. Volunteering at Ruby's school gave her a sense of purpose, while participating in community events allowed her to form meaningful connections. Most importantly, she was learning to listen, not just to others but to herself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the backyard in a warm, golden glow, Mary Ellen stood by the window, watching Ruby chase fireflies with George. Harry joined her, handing her a glass of wine. They look happy, he observed, nodding toward Ruby and George. Yes, they do, Mary Ellen replied, her voice tinged with awe. Do you think we'll ever get there? Truly happy. Harry hesitated, considering her question. I think happiness isn't a destination. It's a choice. Every day you choose to be better, to do better. And maybe, over time, those choices add up to something real. Mary Ellen nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, for her relationship with Harry, for her place in the community, or for her own personal growth. But she did know one thing. She was ready to keep choosing, keep growing, and keep embracing the journey. This story challenges us to look beyond first impressions and embrace the humanity in everyone. Who in your life deserves a second chance? Share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more inspiring tales.